Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. We have to look whether this whether technology works. If not, you wouldn't miss much, because but we will see. We will see. Let's give it one try. Either it works or it doesn't. If it works, it's slightly better. And overview. Very good. So, a very brief overview of what I wanted to present you, and then, of course, discuss with you. I mean, a presentation is only the first part of it. The second part is discussion. The most important part, actually, is the second one. So I've divided my presentation into 4 sections. The 4 sections being first... No, this is wrong. Okay, doesn't matter. I want to spend only a few minutes on explaining what the position of a special rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief is. Just a few minutes. Then the second, this is actually the first thing. Let's stick that, okay. The second then will be an overview of patterns and motives of violation of freedom of religion or belief. The third section, a brief description of the major conceptual questions. And the fourth part, which is the main part, or the main section, is the concept. Where is it? No, the concept is a bit dark, as you see. It's a bit dark, yeah, okay. Yeah, anyway, I mean, we should not let ourselves be confused by technology. Either it works or it doesn't. I mean, it's no big deal. So, Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, I've taken up that position 2 months ago, and so I'm still very new in that field. It took me as a complete surprise that I was nominated, and I have to face an enormous workload. But the good thing is, it is a wonderful task. It is actually the best of both worlds, the world of the UN bureaucracy and the world of academia, because I'm both. I'm a UN official. I'm working in the name of the UN officially, and still I'm independent. I mean, and this is typical of this type of work, special rapporteurs, or more generally called special procedures. They are an element of dynamism, or supposed to be, I mean, we will see, within the bureaucracy. So I'm in the midst of all the flux of information. I'm in touch, not just in touch, in contact, in conversation with the Office of the High Commissioner on a daily basis. And still I'm independent. And this is very interesting and, of course, also quite challenging. There are currently 40 special procedures. The 40th position was created only yesterday. A new special rapporteur on freedom of assembly. It's new. There are 40, partly devoted to countries like Haiti, like North Korea, like Sudan, so countries of particular concern, and partly devoted to themes like freedom of expression, violence against the women, enforced disappearances, people of African descent, freedom of religion or belief, mass executions, etc. So altogether, countries and themes altogether, it's 40 special procedures with this structure of being part of the UN and still independent. My tasks are 4 layers of tasks. The first is communication with government on concrete cases. So concrete incidents, concrete cases of alleged violation. This communication is confidential, or at least in its first phase, it is confidential. It's a bilateral communication with the Geneva embassy of the various countries concerned. But then, after a while, it's made public. After 60 days, the phase of confidentiality is finished, and then it's made public in the UN, and from next year onwards, all this communication will be made available 3 times a year. So every 4 months. All this communication, so the letters of allegation, the response or the non-response of the government, and comments on the whole procedure. So it's first confidential, but then public. Then Country missions, that's a second task. Since I'm doing that on a pro bono basis and I still earn my salary as a professor, meanwhile at the University of Erlangen, Nuremberg, that can only be done during the semester break, so not that many country missions will be done. The first 3 will be Paraguay, and then a European country. It's not yet clear which one, maybe Italy, maybe Spain, Belgium, Switzerland, Sweden, who knows? Yeah, so, and then the 4th will be an Islamic country, maybe Iran, maybe Morocco, maybe Indonesia. It's not yet clear, so I can't tell you. And I mean, these country missions, and especially their results, will also be presented in the UN fora, so in the Human Rights Council, in the General Assembly. All this is publicly available then. Third task, thematic priority reports to the General Assembly, to the Human Rights Council. The first thematic reports I'm preparing will be on the relationship between freedom of expression, freedom of religion, on freedom of religion in schools, on freedom of religion and family law issues, on the establishment of early warning mechanisms. So it's a broad range of different topics. And the 4th task is also talking about concepts, because the very concept of freedom of religion or belief has become under attack. So it's really a battlefield. Yeah? It's not only a battlefield on questions of implementation, but the very concept, the very idea, what is it, has been debated hotly and continues to be debated in sometimes very harsh ways. So let's go to the next slide. As I said, my task also refers to individual cases, and since they are treated in a spirit of confidentiality, at least in its first phase, I can't disclose what I'm working on. But what I can tell you is there is a shocking degree of hatred. It's unbelievable. If you really go into the cases, the incidents, it's breathtaking. Hatred, unbelievable hatred against minorities, hatred very often, typically, fueled by a combination of fear and contempt. Fear, I mean, it's sometimes very absurd. A small group like the Jehovah's Witnesses, they seem to instigate fear. Yeah? There seems to be something infectious with religious minorities, contaminating the body politic or the community, something like this. Very strange ideas, very strange. But that can fuel really resentment to the degree of physical attacks, killings, sometimes genocidal degrees of killings. So fear and contempt, the 2 sources of a really breathtaking hatred. And of course, these fears, these feelings of resentment are also exploited, they are mobilized by political entrepreneurs. What are the patterns? There's a large degree of different patterns. Of course, it starts with stereotypes, prejudices. In our region here, in Germany, in Western Europe, the main target of prejudice and stereotypes currently is Islam or Muslims. Yeah? And I mean, Geert Wilders, the new self-appointed leader of a pan-European anti-Islamic movement, happens to be in Berlin today, by the way. Yeah? So maybe he's 2 kilometers apart from us, I don't know. So it starts with prejudices that very often go hand in hand with practical discrimination at the workplace, in housing, in education. Minorities sometimes are prohibited from attending the university or having higher education. Intimidation, arrests, security detention, or alleged security detentions, and minorities, people, dissenters, converts, very often also victims of extrajudicial killings, and sometimes of judicial killings, I mean formalized executions. This happens, or violations of freedom of religion or belief, happen in all parts of the world, in all regions, of course in very different degrees. It's not always the same, but they happen everywhere on the globe, in Europe, in the Middle East, in China, in the Americas, in sub-Saharan Africa. And it happens partly in the name of religion, or some would say under the pretext of religion, but also in the name of secularism, or under the pretext of secularism, in the name of national heritage, national identity politics, in the name of law and order. And the most widespread pattern is something very trivial: registration requirements. I mean, 2/3 of the countries in this world have onerous bureaucratic registration requirements. So people who want to practice their religion, they first have to register, they have to fill forms, they have to answer all sorts of questions about their members, about why they want to assembly, about how often, about financial resources, and I mean, so many things. And once there's an error, that can be the pretext to closing the place down, to confiscating money, and this happens all over the place. 2/3 of the countries have really registration procedures, not in order maybe to give extra benefits to religious communities. Okay, that would be a legitimate purpose to say, okay, in order to have tax exemption, of course you have to fill some forms. Yeah? That is something that the bureaucracy naturally and legitimately is interested in. But as a precondition for the very exercise of a human right. I mean, freedom of religion, after all, is a human right. Yeah? So its very exercise, its enjoyment per se, cannot be dependent on prior registration processes. But this, I mean, it's the most widespread pattern. Victims, very different groups of victims: Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Baha'is, members of traditional religions, atheists, people who don't care about religion, minorities such as Ahmadis, or maybe the most frequently persecuted group, the Jehovah's Witnesses. So very different groups. Let's go to the next slide. Conceptual questions. As I already mentioned briefly in my opening, freedom of religion is a hotly debated topic in different fora of the UN, for instance, in the General Assembly or in the Human Rights Council. And freedom of religion has become under an enormous pressure. And that's why conceptual questions, and my main section, number 4, and the last one, will actually deal with the concept of human rights. But these conceptual questions are not just academic ones. They are not academic questions, but they have an immediately practical relevance also. And to confine myself, to be very short, and in order to spare time for an interactive dialogue with you, I just pick up maybe 2 of the major conceptual questions. The first around the concept of neutrality, which is a somewhat slippery concept. There are voices in Europe, I mean, it's not the European states, but there are voices, political voices in Europe, advocating an understanding of neutrality such that the public space is generally purged of all presence of religion, of all visible religious symbols. So headscarves, crucifixes, burqas, okay, that's a special thing. Minarets should be all eliminated from the public space, at least in state-run institutions. I will come back to the concept of neutrality later on. It can be a meaningful concept, but it can also be used, can also be invoked or abused in such a way that it really does away with the presence of religions in the public space. So this is one battlefield. So around the concept of neutrality, and then another one, a second one, is around resolutions repeatedly tabled, especially by the Organization of Islamic Conference, currently headed by Pakistan, resolutions on combating defamation of religions. I mean, these resolutions have been in the UN debate for more than 10 years now. It peaked during the cartoon crisis, after the publication of the Danish cartoons, and there was a big fight of freedom of expression and its limits, and so religion was very often invoked as a limit to freedom of expression, and sometimes freedom of religion was construed in a sort of antagonistic structure as a principle opposed to or antagonistic to freedom of expression. And the decisive term, the key term, is defamation of religion. So the claim that it should be a human rights concern that religions as such should be protected from some sort of defamatory criticism. I mean, this is another battlefield. And you see, in both cases, I've added a question mark because I didn't want to disclose immediately what my position is. And now let's go to the last slide and to the main. No, there's no. It disappeared. Oh, it's a dark one. Okay, then let's keep it in the dark. Let's keep it in the dark because, okay, I wanted to present my concept of what freedom of religion or belief means. And if I say my concept, it's not my personal one. It's not my personal concept, but I'm drawing on my predecessors, on the previous mandate holders on freedom of religion or belief. The mandate has existed for 25 years now. I'm drawing on Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18 also of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, on the interpretation of that Article 18 by the UN Human Rights Committee, etc., just to make sure it's not my very personal academic point of view, but a concept that, I mean, bases itself on the decisive documents, of reference. So, and now you don't see it, but there are still 4 points I wanted to make. They all sound ridiculously trivial. But they're trivial only from an academic point of view. And what I'm saying is the battle over the concept is not an academic one. From an academic standpoint, it's easy. So the first, and as I said, it sounds very trivial, freedom of religion or belief, if you don't see it, please believe it, is a human right. It is a universal human right. What does it mean? And now this is far from trivial, politically speaking. The rights holders are human beings. The rights holders are human beings alone and together with others, as individuals or in communities. But it's human beings, not religions. It's not religions. Of course, freedom of religion or belief has to do with religions and with belief systems. But it's only, the approach is through the individual human being, alone and together with others. It's via human beings, via respect for their dignity, for their freedom, that religion and belief then comes into play. It's not the other way around. It's not the other way around. The starting point is human beings. The dignity of the human being, the freedom in recognition of the dignity of the human being. So every human being's personal self-understanding as a believer, as a passionate believer, or a less passionate believer, maybe also as a non-believer, or as an alternative believer. And it's only from this starting point that we finally approach religions. So it's not that we, let's say, look up in the dictionary, what are the major religions? Yeah, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and then, okay, look what that means for individuals. It's just the other way around. Just the other way around. So the human right of freedom of religion or belief does not protect religions, but it protects human beings, their belief. And since this human right is a universal human right, every person's human right, freedom of religion or belief has a broad, very broad application. Very broad application. Cannot be confined to, let's say, a particular set of religions. So those religions sometimes referred to as the divinely revealed religions, monotheistic religions, traditional religions. No. The starting point is human beings, what they think, what they feel, their search for meaning, their self-understanding. So you end up with a very broad range of positions, of convictions, also manifestations of those convictions in practical life that come into play via freedom of religion and belief. So everything is covered. Everything that has become a matter of belief, of conviction, of commitment, of practice. So this is one important point, and the Human Rights Committee, the UN committee in charge of interpreting the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has, and now I'm quoting, said that freedom of religion and belief covers theistic, non-theistic, as well as atheistic convictions. That's why it's called freedom of religion or belief. So very broad. Second point. Now, this sounds even more trivial, but as I said, in the political arena, it's not trivial. Freedom of religion has to do with freedom. Surprise, surprise. It has to do with freedom. So, for instance, if you raise the question, a question that has been raised over many, many years, what about the headscarf? Does freedom of religion or belief protect the headscarf? The answer will be, wait a moment, it protects freedom to wear the headscarf or not to wear the headscarf. So both ways, the positive element, the negative, they are co-original, two sides of one and the same coin. So it's only indirectly that the headscarf comes into play. It does come into play, but the starting point is freedom. So, or for instance, what about faith-based religious instruction in public schools? Again, the answer is, the decisive point is freedom. Freedom to participate or not to participate, to have exit options available. The starting point is freedom, not identity. And this is, the negative side, or the challenge that one has to really clarify the freedom-based approach of this human right, and I would say of all human rights, the freedom approach against identity rhetorics. Identity is a very problematic concept in the framework of human rights. So, freedom of religion does not protect collective identities, traditions, or feelings, but freedom. Freedom, as I said, to search for meaning personally together with others, to exchange views, to challenge maybe others, to try to persuade others, to be persuaded or not to be persuaded. Freedom, freedom, freedom. And if you take that seriously, then it's very obvious that freedom of religion or belief is inherently linked to other rights of freedom. In particular, freedom of expression. Again, this is far from trivial, because now the real battle is, as I briefly mentioned, how do these two freedoms relate? Freedom of religion, freedom of expression. And it's often construed in such a way that freedom of expression should be limited by freedom of religion. But if it's construed in such an antagonistic way, the freedom aspect of freedom of religion, the very essence of it, can evaporate or can become marginalized. Yeah? This is a real danger, and that's why we have to stick to that. For all the conflicts that can arise in the human rights framework, it's not so easy with the interrelatedness and indivisibility of human rights. There are conflicts, there are tensions. The spirit of these rights, freedom of religion or belief, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, is one and the same. The general direction is one and the same. And so they must be kept together. And only on this basis then we have yeah, of course, we have to go into the details, and whenever you go into the details, things get more complicated. But the basic philosophy is they are inherently linked. Because otherwise, if you play off freedom of religion against freedom of expression, you end up not having freedom of religion. You have something else, maybe the freedom of religions as collective units, or the freedom of their authoritarian spokespersons not to be challenged, not to be what they would call offended. But this would be something else. I mean, then in the very end, freedom would just be a label, would lose its meaning, would lose its critical barb. Okay, so now the third point of the concept of freedom of religion and belief is maybe less trivial on the surface. It's equality. It's equality. All human rights are not only rights of freedom, but they're also rights of equality. And I mean, to put it in a nutshell, simply let's remind ourselves of the famous, frequently cited first sentence of the first article of the first international human rights document, the Universal Declaration. You all know it by heart, I guess. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Free and equal in dignity and rights. So the dignity of all human beings is one and the same, it's equal. And the basic rights, the elementary rights deriving from that dignity or from respect for dignity should be the same for everyone. So, like all human rights, also freedom of religion or belief as a human right has an egalitarian aspect. And in practical terms, it's the claim to non-discrimination. Also, equality is spelled out as non-discrimination. So, taking freedom of religion or belief seriously means we have to fight against discrimination, especially in this context against discrimination based on, for instance, the distinction of traditional religion, new religion, traditional majority religion, minorities, dominant religions, and maybe also merely tolerated religions center the margins. So fighting for non-discrimination in practice means giving special attention to religious minorities. In many countries, the situation is exacerbated by the fact that very often religious minorities are also ethnic minorities. Ethnicity, religion very often overlap, and that's why minorities often face a sort of attitude that can amount to racism. I mean, there's racism also in dealing with religious minorities. Still, we should be careful to keep to be aware of the difference between ethnicity and religion. That is also one of the big conceptual questions, that sometimes ethnicity and religion are mixed conceptually, and this leads to a lot of dangers, because the element of free choice, free orientation, search for meaning, then can get out of sight, which itself then has repercussions, negative repercussions for the freedom approach of freedom of religion or belief. Now, the very last bullet point is neutrality. Sorry, I didn't. The very last bullet point, neutrality. So let me repeat the first three ones. Universal human right, right of freedom, right of equality, neutrality. Neutrality is a source of confusion. There is a meaningful understanding and a less meaningful understanding of neutrality. Let me start with the meaningful. Neutrality can be understood as a fairness principle. I mean, this would be my approach. A fairness principle, meaning the state in charge of guaranteeing human rights, and in particular freedom of religion or belief, should not favor one religion or one set of religions over others. The state should not be biased. The state should not simply identify its essence, its legitimacy with one religious tradition at the expense, to the detriment of others. Neutrality as a fairness principle, of course, is never simply accomplished. It's something one can easily say it doesn't work in practice. Okay. Still, the aspiration makes sense. I would go a step further and say this aspiration is it's actually irreplaceable. And it is in this sense that I would really fight for a neutral state. I mean, a state is aspiring to be not biased, to be fair to all, to be fair. And it's never easy to do that, and will never be once and for all be fulfilled. Neutrality in this understanding as the aspiration to fairness or as a fairness principle has its source in freedom of religion or belief. So it can also be called a second-order principle of justice, deriving from a first-order principle, the universal human right of freedom of religion or belief. So in this sense, neutrality is meaningful, it's even irreplaceable as an aspiration. But then, in the public debate, also in the literature, you very often come across a different understanding of neutrality, and very often they are mixed. Neutrality is something, okay, distance, yeah? Don't be mingled, I mean, with these religious affairs. They have an element of unpredictability often. Yeah? Religion is not easily predictable. Yeah? So, and for a state, it's very convenient to say, okay, we don't care for religions. Okay, we leave people do their religious practice in peace as long as they stick to the private sphere. So it's a privatization of religion, a purging of the public space, especially the state-related public space, of all religious symbols, of the presence of religion. Yeah? And this neutrality as not touching, as sterile separation, or as not caring, can easily take on a repressive flavor. And this, I mean, we can observe this also in discussions in Europe. And one element is, for instance, the headscarf debate, removing all headscarf, removing all crucifixes, maybe even the minarets. Yeah, that, I mean, sometimes under the pretext of neutrality. And it should be clear that this is a completely different understanding of neutrality than the one I sketched out 2 minutes ago. So, must be all very clear. Now to conclude with 1 or 2 sentences, freedom of religion or belief is a fascinating subject. A lot needs to be done, I can tell you, if you really go into the cases, the incidents all over the world. A lot needs to be done. But it can be done only on the basis of clarity, and that's why the conceptual questions are not merely of academic relevance, they are immediately practically relevant as well, and that's why I'm looking forward to have a discussion. Thank you very much. Yeah, please.
Alan Berman from Australia, and I have to confess, the United States as well. So I wanted to...
Lucky guy you are.
I wanted to
with 2
ask
passports.
you a question.
Yes.
Because in the United States we have a Bill of Rights which includes freedom of speech.
Yeah.
In Australia we do not have a Bill of Rights, although we have a few rights scattered throughout the Constitution, including a non-establishment clause and a free exercise clause, which has been interpreted by the High Court very restrictively. Within the last month or so, there was the situation with the idiotic pastor who had a following of 30 individuals and proposed to burn the Quran in Florida. And there's someone here who deals with the media, and it created such an uproar. First of all, it has lots of implications. Number one, why is the media interested in some idiot who has a following of 30 in creating protests in Indonesia about their religious beliefs? Why is the media even covering this story? that to such an extent that the Secretary of State had to say this is the world we live in.
Yeah.
The President of the United States had to say something. The leader of the forces in Afghanistan said you're putting our forces at risk. And they finally, the Imam called him up to New York and he said, I'll never burn a Quran. He had never read the Quran. And I say to myself, because we've just had a debate in Australia on whether we should adopt a Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
They had a national consultation process, and they recommended that we adopt a statutory rather than an entrenched Bill of Rights, and the government rejected it and decided no Bill of Rights at all. And in this context, I'm sort of conflicted, because I think that in that situation, freedom of expression, we have anti-vilification laws. That person who burnt the Quran could have been held liable under our anti-discrimination laws for a religious vilification, for inciting hatred towards a religious group, because we don't have a right to freedom of speech. So I'd like to know your views on this.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Maybe to start with the Quran, burn a Quran Day, as it was staged, and luckily didn't take place. In most European countries, we do have constitutions, we do have bills of rights, but the limitation regulations are different from the US. And if you look at international human rights documents, such as the European Convention for Human Rights or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 19, freedom of speech, freedom of expression is not unlimited. Of course, the burden of proof, if you want to limit, is on those who argue in favor of limitations. So limitations must be prescribed by law, cannot be done simply at the discretion of the administration, must pursue a legitimate purpose, must be proportionate. So there are some, it's cautious. But then, following Article 19, there's Article 20, which in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which explicitly says incitement to hatred that might lead, or is meant to lead, to real discrimination, to real damage, violence, is not legitimate. And can even, and this, I mean, can even require criminal prosecution, hate speech. The threshold must be very high. Because if you look around the world, there are many states who argue, okay, in order to have peaceful relations or harmony, yeah, please don't offend, and then that can very easily have a chilling effect on freedom of speech. It's a very sensible subject. The threshold must be high, but still, there is a possibility to say freedom of speech is good, it's necessary, it's the vital center of a democracy, it's the life of democracy, it's via discourse, but some use of discourse by which others are not respected as members of discourse anymore. They are at least symbolically eliminated by means of very strict insult, by very harsh offenses. In the sake of discourse itself cannot be legitimate. Yeah? And the best way of redeeming, of rectifying that is to have a sense, and that raises the media question, of what is fairness, what is unfairness, that the media itself, those engaging in discourse have a sense that we should not leave freedom of speech to the self-appointed heroes of political incorrectness, the Geert Wilders type. I mean, he claims freedom of speech, but he has a party in which he's the only member, so he is not the advocate of democratic discourse. One has to be very clear. Yeah? So to rectify that by being aware in the medium of discourse itself is the best way. But then still, as a last resort, criminal prosecution can come into play. The threshold must be high, but still it is a possibility. Yeah? So European states are, in that regard, different from the US. And the US actually has entered a reservation to this Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Yeah? Yeah, media. I mean, why? that's a question. Why did they make such a fuss about this stupid, strange, crazy person? Yes, right. Yeah, yeah. I have no answer. Maybe to make the question more complicated, I'm not only refraining from the answer, but I'm going to make it more complicated. I've been wondering, for instance, to give a very different example, why Geert Wilders, with his film Fitna, did not succeed. Perhaps you remember when he presented that film simply equating Islam with terrorism. He had announced that 6 months previously. Okay, now it's going, now the clock is ticking, the film will be shown in 3 months, in 2 months, in 1 day. Wow, nothing happened, or very little happened. The media did not jump on it, interestingly. Quite interesting. Why not? I'm wondering, I don't have the answers. But this is a positive example where it was only, I mean, everyone knew it would happen, but politicians had spoken out very clearly against it, European politicians. Unlike in the cartoon crisis, they were very clear, this is not helpful. It's even if we don't threat criminal sanctions, it is not helpful. Don't do it. The media were impressed. They didn't jump on it. Of course it was shown, but only in the internet as a sort of private YouTube version. Yeah? It's not the big thing. Yeah? So this is a positive example. But I don't have the answer.
My name is Sarah Imani. I'm a PhD student in legal theory of international law, and my question refers to the concept of neutrality. And I would like to know what you think such works as those of Habermas and Rawls can contribute to clarify or define the concept.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I like Habermas better than Rawls. I also like Rawls, but I mean, Rawls with the veil of ignorance has made his own life very complicated because everyone, or many people, would, why should we be ignorant? Okay, it's not meant this way. It's a metaphor, but a somewhat misleading metaphor for neutrality. But it's only a negation of the negation. I mean, it's a very roundabout way. Still, you can learn something from Rawls, but I mean, the metaphors he uses really gives rise to a lot of confusion. And Habermas, he's really the philosopher of discourse, starting with discourse, taking discourse seriously. And I discovered a very interesting footnote, not in Habermas, but in a person blaming Habermas. There was a book published in Germany 2 or 3 years ago on torture. And the author wanted to break the way for a moderate use of torture. Yeah, you know this sort of debate. It happened in the last years. And then Habermas was invited to a workshop. Habermas refused. And this person accused him that the philosopher of discourse, refuses to engage in discourse. But he's right, Habermas, because this little footnote in which Habermas is accused of not engaging in discourse is quite revealing that discourse is not just blah, 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 talking until we're all tired, but discourse in Habermas means there are some prerequisites, there are some axiomatic elements such as mutual respect. And torturing a person is the ultimate degree of disrespect. So talking about maybe potential use of moderate torture is not just something that is a legitimate object of discourse. So that is quite interesting. So to give you a short answer, I prefer Habermas, but you can also learn a lot from Rawls.
Hello, I'm Mattia Magrassi. I'm postdoc researcher in public comparative law in the University of Trento. And I found particularly interesting the part of your speech in which you covered the conceptual approach to the right of religion as an individual right to freedom in opposition to an identity approach. And but I'd like you to tell something more about this, in particular, how this approach can cover many aspects of the religious phenomenon that are collective aspects. For example, the building of religious buildings. Yeah. There's a controversy in Italy about the proposal to to build a big mosque, and there's this paradoxical situation. The Catholic bishop of Milan is in favor of it, and some politicians are strongly against it. And I wonder how this approach that you explained can cover the problem of this collective dimension, that is the possibility to build a building. I mean.
Yes, I mean, every human right is a right that the individual can lay claim to because of his or her dignity. But in the exercise of every human right, there's always a dimension of communication, of community, of society, every human right. Let's say freedom of expression, of course, it is your personal right, but it does make sense only in community with others. I mean, simply speaking, or like Plato, the soul with itself, okay, yeah? The monologue is not the ideal situation. Everything, yeah? That applies to every human right. It is the right of the individual, but its exercise is not simply individualistic. And it's fairly obvious with freedom of religion or belief, of course. It is a freedom also of those individuals who have maybe dissenting positions, and then it becomes very important. But it also is quite important for minorities to organize their communitarian life. Yeah? But it's communities based on individuals. It's not the protection is not due to religions as such, identities, with the result then that those who may challenge these identities get into trouble, yeah, by blasphemy laws or whatever. Yeah? It is rights of persons, but it explicitly says, for instance, in Article 18 of the ICCPR, alone and together with others. Yeah? It's freedom to not only to have a personal conviction, but also to manifest this conviction. So it has something to do with the outward world, not only with conscience, yeah? Practice together with others, and alone, I mean also in distance. It's free movement. Yeah? So the communitarian aspects, I prefer the word communitarian to collective, are important. And this is something that comes into play in all human rights. Still, the first holder is every human being.
Morning, Professor.
Good morning.
I come from a country, Malaysia, where you have the three major religions.
Yes.
Where the majority practice Islam,
Yeah.
Buddhism, and Christianity.
Yeah.
We have to practice religion. That's a right.
Yes.
But in the process of practicing, we must also be aware of other religions. So in this country where I live, where I was born, we have a very unique example how various religions can stay together.
Yeah.
If you come to my country, you have lots of minarets,
Yeah, no.
lots of churches, lots of Buddhist temples, Hindu temples. In fact, in every street you could, lanes and by lanes, you have a Hindu shrine. All this is allowed to grow. And this forms an important aspect of human development. In our Article 11 of our Constitution, we have freedom of religion. We don't say about other things, just freedom of religion. And in this context, we are taught, or rather we are taught from our early age that one has to be respectful, mindful of the other religion. And when we hear the constant ramifications of, in the West, perhaps they are wrestling thanks to the media in the West is so powerful, immediate, they publish anything and everything through the fascinations and through the imagination of each writer, but we don't have that in our country. We are careful. Our journalists are told, you must be careful, because we have races who have built their status or their respect over the years. And we can't break that. And thank God, I mean, I believe in God, no? That our leaders are very pragmatic. You know, they allow freedom to practice your religion. But of course, you get some news clips from Malaysia. It says that this cannot be. And what you have said, sometimes you have bureaucratic officials. Mm-hmm. They feel that by doing something, they go straight to heaven. Mm-hmm. So you cannot stop that. Mm-hmm. But we have good leaders who tell bureaucratic leaders, hey, come on, you have to be careful. Mm-hmm. That's one. Okay, my question here is, I'm a bit confused about neutrality. If you decide to a certain extent behave, well, it's good to be neutral, but you have to take good affirmative actions so that everybody can practice what they believe. And the second point, which I think I congratulate you, because I'm a communitarian developer, no? I'm a human rights lawyer. Communitarian aspect is very important when you're dealing with human rights. Communities have different concepts about religion. So when they all come together, you have to outreach to the community as a human being, because the cornerstone of human right is human dignity.
Yeah.
You take away human dignity, there's no human rights. Mm-hmm. So my question is, how do you relate to human rights in terms of neutrality and in terms of political expediency? Today, if I want to be a politician, in the narrow sense, I might as well take do something that will arouse the emotions of another community, right? So, how do you stop that? This genie come lately politicians. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I was in Malaysia twice. You are right. There are minarets and there are church bells. It's a pluralistic country. Sometimes I'm wondering, however, what about the minorities of the minorities, or those who want to maybe blur the line or cross the line? Yeah? Because freedom of religion is also the freedom not only of the other groups, but also of those with maybe changing opinions, those who want to convert. And I mean, it's definitely a pluralistic country, but still, even in a pluralistic country, not always pluralism is a result of a human rights approach. Still, I have my questions. But to answer your question, or if I've understood it correctly, I'm not neutral in all regards. I should not be neutral, for instance, about human rights. I'm definitely not neutral. Yeah? I mean, neutrality, as I said, is a second-order principle. I would never start with neutrality. Never start. If it is a meaningful, if it's meant to be a meaningful concept, it must derive from something substantial. And in my understanding, it is respect for freedom of religion or belief. And I mean, respecting, and now from the perspective of the state, respecting the freedom of religion or belief of all citizens, of all residents, means the state should not be partisan simply, should not be the protector of this group against the other. With affirmative action, we have touched on a sensitive issue. Human rights conventions do give space for some affirmative actions, but the term used, for instance, in CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, is not affirmative action, but it's more precise. It is temporary special measures. So one of the adjectives is temporary. Yeah? It's only in order to maybe if structural forms of injustice have hardened to such a degree that one has to use quota in order to overcome that, but it's temporary. Temporary special measures, okay, maybe a means to enhance equality, so to fight discrimination. I'm a little bit reserved about affirmative action. At least it requires a high degree of precision in order not to become a pretext for privileging people. So one must be very precise on this too. And I absolutely agree with what you said about human dignity. I mean, this is the key term of human rights, and sometimes it's good to remind ourselves of the first sentence of the preamble of the Universal Declaration, which starts with recognition. Recognition of the inherent dignity of all members of the human family. It's something inherent in the human being. And this respect that we owe to each human being then provides the basis for giving specific rights, the elementary rights that all human beings should equally have claim to.
Professor Dr. Bielefeldt, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you. I think it's clear that you have exceeded our expectations, both in the panel discussion yesterday and your wonderful, clear, and also refreshing reflections this morning on the freedom of religion. And it was really a special honor to have you with us. So if you could all please join me in thanking Professor Dr. Bielefeldt. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.